Let's jump right in. Today, we're exploring the tenure of the 15th U.S. President, James Buchanan. But we're not just going to tell a historical story here. We're going to treat this as a severe, real-world case study in executive decision-making. Sometimes history puts a leader at a crossroads, where every single choice they make, or don't make, dictates the survival of an entire organization, or in this case, a nation. As we go through this explainer, I really want you to look at Buchanan's tenure through the lens of crisis management, because the lessons we are about to unpack regarding action versus inaction, they are absolutely timeless. Here is a quick look at our agenda. We'll be breaking down his presidency across 5 compounding phases. First, an experienced leader's ascent. Then, the Dred Scott miscalculation. Followed by the Panic of 1857 inaction. Next, paralysis during secession. And we'll wrap up with the legacy of indecision. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, an experienced leader's ascent. To really understand the failure, we first have to establish the baseline. And honestly, Buchanan brought some incredibly impressive qualifications to the executive office. Born in Pennsylvania in 1791, this guy wasn't just some rookie politician who stumbled into power. Just look at this track record. We're talking about a Dickinson College graduate, a highly successful lawyer, years of high-level service in both the U.S. Congress and the Senate, a diplomat to Russia, and Secretary of State. He had literally held practically every major office you could hold. So when he defeated Republican candidate John C. Fremont in 1856 and took the oath of office in early 1857, the public expectation was massive. People genuinely hoped this seasoned, veteran CEO of government had the exact resume needed to keep a deeply divided nation together. But to be fair to him, we absolutely have to impartially recognize the operating environment he was inheriting. The United States was essentially fracturing into 2 entirely different operational factions. On one side, you had the North, staunchly opposed to the institution of slavery, and on the other, the South, totally determined to preserve it. This wasn't just a minor disagreement in a boardroom. It was a fundamental, structural divide. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes, high-pressure environment that demands active, decisive leadership. That brings us to Section 2, the Dred Scott miscalculation. Literally right as he takes office, this explosive judicial ruling drops, forcing an immediate executive reaction. We're talking about the infamous Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court. The court declared that African Americans were not U.S. citizens and ruled that Congress basically lacked the constitutional authority to ban slavery in the territories. From a purely management perspective, Buchanan was just handed a ruling that touched the absolute core of the nation's deepest divide. So the big question was, how does the chief executive handle this? Well, instead of stepping up and managing the fallout, Buchanan evaluated this ruling as a convenient opportunity to offload his executive responsibility onto the judiciary. And guys, this brilliantly illustrates the danger of an executive assuming an external ruling will just magically solve an internal systemic issue. Buchanan's flawed hypothesis was that the Supreme Court's word would permanently settle the slavery debate. Just quiet everyone down, problem solved, right? He outsourced his leadership to the courts. But here comes the harsh reality check. The North didn't quiet down at all, they were outraged. And the South, they didn't compromise, they were emboldened. The direct consequence of Buchanan sitting back and hoping the problem would just solve itself was that the organization, the nation, fractured even further. It's a classic leadership trap. You simply cannot hope a technicality will resolve a massive cultural and moral crisis without active leadership. Moving right along to Section 3, Panic of 1857 inaction. To make matters even worse, a second, massive, compounding variable strikes the nation, a severe economic shock. The Panic of 1857 hits. Banks are closing, massive job losses sweep the country, and trade drops sharply. Now, what's really fascinating and frankly terrifying here is the stark contrast between these devastating economic indicators and the executive response. The response was zero. Intervention, none. By refusing to intervene economically, Buchanan's decision-making process completely undermined whatever national stability was left. Think about it. When people are losing their livelihoods and their leader stays entirely hands-off, any remaining faith in the system just collapses. Now let's look at Section 4, paralysis during secession. This all builds toward the absolute climax of his presidency following the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, wins the election, and the reaction is a complete organizational collapse. Several southern states look at the incoming administration and immediately trigger secession. They decide to break away from the United States entirely. For a sitting president who still has months left in his term, this is the ultimate red alert crisis. The country is literally breaking apart on your watch. So here is the crucial point. This is the ultimate example of executive paralysis. Buchanan's core legal beliefs completely contradicted his willingness to actually do anything about the crisis. He firmly believed, as a matter of law, that states seceding from the Union was illegal. He knew it was wrong, yet he absolutely refused to use executive power or military force to stop them. He was caught in a trap of his own making. It's like seeing the building burning down, agreeing that arson is a crime, but refusing to turn on the fire hoses because you aren't 100% sure you have the explicit legal authority to use the water. The sequence of events from here clearly tracks the inevitable, tragic consequence of passive leadership. He makes these half-hearted attempts to hold on to federal assets like Fort Sumter, but without a cohesive, decisive strategy, the situation rapidly deteriorates. He essentially just tries to run out the clock. He leaves the White House in March 1861, handing an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe over to Abraham Lincoln, and mere weeks later, the Civil War erupts. Now, did Buchanan cause the underlying issues? No. But his complete failure to actively manage the crisis absolutely guaranteed the worst possible outcome. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the legacy of indecision. Just a quick, surprising aside before we wrap up, to add a bit of personal context to the man. The number one, Buchanan remains the one and only U.S. president to never marry, remaining a lifelong bachelor. He also holds the distinction of being the one and only president ever elected from the state of Pennsylvania. Now, despite historians almost universally ranking him among the least successful presidents due to this massive failure in crisis management, he spent his retirement trying to defend his inaction. He retreated to his estate at Wheatland, wrote a book trying to protect his image, and famously stated, "History will vindicate my memory." He genuinely believed that future generations would look back and agree that his hands-off, legally cautious approach was the right call. But history has decidedly disagreed. When the moment required a visionary, decisive leader, he chose to be a passive administrator bound by technicalities. And that leaves us with a profound lesson on leadership. In times of severe crisis, refusing to act is in itself a highly destructive decision. James Buchanan spent his entire adult life preparing for the top job, only to freeze when it mattered the most. So I'll leave you with this question. Can history ever forgive an executive whose greatest failure was simply refusing to make a decision? The next time you face a critical juncture in your own career or organization, remember Buchanan. Sometimes the risk of taking bold action is far, far less than the devastating cost of doing nothing at all.